We've all had those moments, right? The coffee spills just as you're heading out the door.
Or, your presentation software decides now's the time to glitch right when you click present.
Exactly. And you hear that little voice, that sort of cynical sigh. If anything can go wrong, it will.
Yeah, Murphy's Law. Most people know the phrase, maybe use it as a kind of dark joke or, an excuse.
Just bad luck, right? Oh, well, Murphy's Law.
But if you stop right there, you're actually missing the most important part. What if that simple phrase, the one we joke about,
Yeah.
what if it isn't just about expecting things to fail, but it's actually like a fundamental principle, one that holds the key to preventing failure?
Yeah, that's interesting. And that's really the mission for this deep dive, isn't it? We've got this stack of sources you brought in, aerospace history, psychology, even everyday physics.
Right.
And we're going to use them to get way beyond that cliche. We want to unpack what Murphy's Law really means.
Where it came from, why it feels so persistent.
Yeah, so universal. And crucially, why understanding it is so important for actually building things that don't fail, whether that's a rocket or just, getting your morning routine right.
Exactly. So we're going to walk you through the history, the psychology behind it, the real world impact, all based on this material. Think of it as getting properly informed on this surprisingly vital idea.
Okay, let's dive in. Where did it start? You said it's not some ancient proverb. There's a name, right?
Yeah.
Captain Edward A. Murphy, Jr.
That's the one, Captain Murphy. He was an American aerospace engineer working back in 1949.
Okay. What was he doing?
He was involved in these pretty intense U.S. Air Force rocket sled tests. They were trying to figure out how much G-force, how much deceleration a human pilot could actually withstand.
Wow. Rocket sleds and G-force testing on humans. Sounds like a place where you really need things to go right.
Absolutely. Precision was everything. And they used this complex setup, sensors attached to the pilot to get all the data.
Makes sense.
So the sources described this incident. There was a technician responsible for wiring up these sensors. And while he managed to wire every single one of them backwards.
Wait, not just one or two. Every single sensor.
Every single one, systematically wrong across the board.
Huh. So what happened?
Well, they ran the test. Hugely expensive, high stakes. But because all the sensors were wired incorrectly, zero usable data. Nothing. The whole test was a complete wash.
All because of that one basic human error in the setup.
Exactly. A fundamental mistake.
And that's the moment. Seeing that total failure from a seemingly simple error, that's where the quote comes from.
That's the story, yeah. According to the accounts, Murphy, seeing this complete bust, apparently said something like, if there's any way they can do it wrong, they will.
If there's any way they can do it wrong, they will.
Okay.
All right, that's slightly different from the popular version. It's specifically about the potential for mistakes being realized. Human error, mostly.
Right, and that distinction is absolutely crucial. The sources really hammer this home. His original point wasn't just, oh, everything's doomed.
Not just pessimism.
No, it was a very practical, sharp observation made in a high-risk engineering context. It actually became a driving principle, especially in fields like aerospace, nuclear power, even computing later on.
How so?
It pushed for really careful planning, for building in redundancy backup systems, for rigorous checks. It wasn't despair, it was a call to action. Assume error is possible and design defensively against it.
So this specific incident, this quote from 1949, somehow morphs into the universal, if anything can go wrong, it will, that we all use.
Okay.
Why does that broader version stick? Why does it feel so true for everyone?
Well, the sources point to two sort of core reasons, two undeniable truths, really.
Right.
First, like we just saw with the sensors, human error happens. It's inevitable. We make mistakes, we forget things, we get distracted, we misunderstand instructions.
It's just not perfect.
Exactly. And second, complex systems. Well, they tend to fail in complex ways. Think about any process with multiple steps, multiple parts, multiple people involved.
Like building something, writing code, even just making breakfast sometimes feels complex.
Right. Each step, each component, each handoff is a potential failure point.
And if each one has even a tiny chance of going wrong,
then the overall probability of something somewhere along the line going sideways increases dramatically. It's not magic. It's just statistics meeting complexity and human fallibility.
that makes sense. The more complex it is, the more chances for one of those inevitable human errors or just component failures to pop up. Okay, let's look at some concrete examples from the sources. This is where it gets real, sometimes tragically so. NASA's Mars Climate Orbiter in '99. That one's kind of unbelievable.
Oh, it's a textbook case, isn't it? A catastrophic failure from such a basic error. We're talking a $327.6 million spacecraft. gone.
And the reason.
Simply because one engineering team used imperial units pounds for their calculations, and the other team, the one receiving that data for navigation, they assumed it was in metric units. Newtons.
You're kidding. Pounds versus newtons. That's what doomed the entire mission. How does that slip through?
And that is Murphy's Law in action right there. It was a simple, fundamental oversight in how data was handled between teams. A potential point of failure that wasn't properly checked wasn't standardized.
Wow.
So that potential for error, that unchecked variable, just became the actual catastrophic failure when the orbiter burned up in the Martian atmosphere because its trajectory was wrong.
An incredibly expensive mistake from a tiny oversight. Thinking about public tragic failures.
Yeah.
The Challenger disaster in 1986 is also in the material.
Absolutely. And deeply tragic. Another clear example where a known risk ended up happening.
Known risk.
Yeah. The sources confirm engineers had raised serious flags about the O-rings, the seals on the rocket boosters, especially their reliability in cold weather.
But they launched anyway.
Despite the warnings, yeah, there was pressure to launch, and the temperatures that morning were freezing.
Directly impacting the O-rings, leading to the explosion.
Exactly. The very failure mode they'd been warned about. So here, the potential failure was identified, but the system, the decision-making process allowed it to proceed. It wasn't an unknown issue. It was a known risk that was essentially disregarded.
Murphy's Law almost feels like it's saying, I told you so in those cases. Pay attention to the warnings.
It really underscores that need to heed those potential failure points, especially when the stakes are so incredibly high.
Okay, let's go even further back. The Titanic, 1912. The unsinkable ship. That seems like tempting fate, right? Defying Murphy's Law.
It does, doesn't it? And it really highlights the danger of overconfidence, which the sources pinpoint as a key factor.
Hitting an iceberg feels like, well, unavoidable bad luck sometimes.
Maybe. But the material points out factors that were controllable. The crew apparently got multiple warnings about icebergs in the shipping lanes.
But they didn't slow down or change course enough.
They either didn't give the warnings enough weight or just pushed ahead, overconfidence maybe, and then famously...
Not enough lifeboats.
Exactly. Because they were so sure the ship itself was practically infallible, they skimped on the critical backup system, the lifeboats. They didn't truly design the whole system, including safety protocols, with the genuine possibility of catastrophic failure in mind.
They ignored the what if. Okay, and another major one from 1986. Chernobyl. That feels less like one mistake and more like everything going wrong at once.
That's precisely it. Chernobyl wasn't a single point of failure. The sources describe it as a cascade, a whole series of things aligning disastrously.
Like what?
Well, you had a poorly planned and executed safety test. You had operators disregarding established safety protocols, making critical errors. Plus, there were underlying design flaws in that type of reactor.
So multiple vulnerabilities stacked up. Human error, procedural violations, design issues.
And the warnings, the checks that should have stopped it, were overridden or ignored. When you have that many potential failures converging, disaster becomes almost baked in. It's Murphy's Law magnified, showing how fragile complex systems are if you don't respect all the ways they might fail.
Okay, those are huge, dramatic examples.
Right.
Let's bring it down to something more. Every day. The sources mention the classic toast example. Why does toast always seem to land butter side down? Feels personal.
Chuckles slightly.
Right.
Like the universe is specifically out to get your carpet. But the science behind it is actually pretty interesting. It's a mix of physics and our own psychology.
It's physics, not just cosmic spite.
Apparently not entirely. Physics tells us that when toast slides off, say, a table, it starts to rotate. Now, the average kitchen table isn't that high.
Right.
So the toast typically only has enough time in the air to make about half a rotation before it hits the floor.
So if it starts butter side up, half a rotation means it lands.
Butter side down. More often than not, just based on typical table height and gravity.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah.
But what about the psychology part?
That's where negativity bias comes in. We remember the annoying, messy outcomes, the butter stain, much more vividly than the times it lands dry side down, or the times we don't drop it at all.
So the bad outcome sticks in our memory, making it feel like it happens all the time.
Exactly. So it seems like Murphy's Law is always at play, even though it might just be physics combined with how our brains tend to focus on the negative.
That's fascinating. It connects perfectly to the whole psychological angle of why Murphy's Law feels so true. It's not just out there, it's in here too, in our heads.
Absolutely. The sources highlight a few key cognitive biases. We've mentioned negativity bias, bad events just have more impact on our memory.
So the one time the printer jams feels way more significant than the 99 times it worked fine.
Precisely. It reinforces that feeling of, see, things always go wrong. Then there's the gap between our expectations and reality.
Also,
If we just sort of assume everything should go right, then any failure, any little hiccup feels more dramatic. Like it's an affront, like Murphy's Law is personally messing with us. We're surprised by failure, even though, rationally, failure is always a possibility.
we expect perfection, so imperfection feels
Yeah.
like an attack.
Kind of. And then there's something called the planning fallacy. Humans are just notoriously bad at planning, realistically.
Oh, yeah. In what way?
We consistently underestimate how long things will take, how much they'll cost, and crucially, all the potential risks and things that could go wrong along the way.
We're too optimistic. We don't budget for problems.
Exactly. We don't build in enough buffer because we're sort of convinced it'll all go smoothly this time. And then when those underestimated risks inevitably pop up, it feels like Murphy's Law sabotaged our perfect plan.
When really the plan wasn't realistic about the potential for sabotage from the start.
Pretty much. The potential for failure wasn't given enough weight.
Okay, so it's a combination of reality complexity, human error, and our own psychology.
Hmm?
Given all that, how do fields where failure is absolutely not an option, like engineering or software development, actually function? They can't just shrug and say, well, Murphy?
Oh, absolutely not. For serious engineers, developers, designers, Murphy's Law isn't a joke. It's like a fundamental operating principle you have to design around.
You design expecting failure.
You design knowing failure is possible, yes. You build systems assuming that if a component can fail, eventually it will, and you need to mitigate that.
So what does that look like in practice?
Well, things like redundancy, building in backups. If one system fails, another kicks in.
Like having multiple engines on an airplane or backup generator.
Exactly. Or fail-safes. Designing things so if they do fail, they fail in a safe way, they shut down or go into a stable state rather than causing a bigger problem.
Okay.
And then there are systematic processes like FMEA, failure mode, and effects analysis. That's where teams literally sit down and brainstorm every conceivable way something could break or go wrong.
They actively hunt for the potential Murphy scenarios before they happen.
Proactively, yes. What could fail? Why would it fail? What would the consequences be? And how can we prevent it or lessen the impact?
That sounds intense.
It is.
Like
Think about aviation. It's often cited as the safest form of transport. Why? Not because planes never have problems. It's because the entire system design, manufacturing, maintenance, pilot training, air traffic control operates under the constant assumption that things can go wrong. Checklists for everything, layers of backups, strict procedures. It's all designed to catch or contain potential failures.
Because assuming everything will just work perfectly, that's the most dangerous assumption of all.
That's the absolute core lesson. Assuming success invites failure. Now, shifting to the digital world, software, the internet. Murphy's Law feels maybe even more relevant there, doesn't it?
Oh, yeah. The complexity seems infinite sometimes.
Yeah.
Bugs, glitches.
And so are the potential failure points. Software bugs are the classic example. You can test something endlessly in the lab,
But then real users get hold of it.
and they will find ways to break it that you never imagined. They click things in weird orders, use it on strange systems, input bizarre data. Users are masters of uncovering unexpected failure modes.
The ultimate stress test.
Pretty much. And think about cybersecurity. That whole field is basically applied Murphy's Law. Security pros have to assume that if a system can be hacked, someone, somewhere, will eventually find a way. Their job is to find those holes first.
A constant battle against potential failures. What about AI?
AI introduces its own layers. If the data you train an AI on is flawed, biased, or incomplete.
Garbage in, garbage out.
Exactly. The AI's decisions or outputs will reflect those flaws. A very sophisticated system failing because of bad input, another flavor of Murphy's Law.
The Knight Capital collapse example from the sources back in 2012 seems like a brutal digital illustration.
Oh, astonishing. A trading firm losing almost $500 million in 45 minutes.
Gone. What happened?
A software glitch. A single piece of faulty code and a new software update deployed to their automated trading system.
And it wasn't caught in testing.
Critically, it wasn't properly tested under realistic, live, high-volume trading conditions before going live. So this faulty code started making erratic trades at massive scale.
Untested code in a live financial system.
Yeah.
Wow. Talk about a potential failure point waiting to happen.
The vulnerability was there, the safeguard, proper testing in the real environment was skipped, and boom, immediate devastating consequences. It really shows how fast things can unravel in complex digital systems.
Okay, so this principle is everywhere. Rockets, toast, software. Given that, what are the key takeaways? How can we actively try to counteract Murphy's Law in our own work, our projects, maybe even just daily life?
The sources offer some really practical strategies. First, and this is huge, test under real conditions. Don't just test the ideal scenario in the lab.
Get it out into the messy real world.
Yes. See how it actually performs.
Hmm.
Second, prepare for the worst by designing things to degrade gracefully. Meaning if one part fails, the whole system doesn't just collapse. Ideally, it keeps working in a limited capacity or at least fails safely without causing more damage. Build in resilience.
Right. Don't let one failure cascade into total failure.
Third, automate error checks whenever you can. Computers are tireless. They can constantly monitor for inconsistencies, deviations, patterns that might signal a problem, things a human might miss.
Use tech to police for potential issues.
Definitely. And finally, maybe the most fundamental thing, just expect the unexpected. Plan for contingencies. Assume people will make mistakes. Assume tech will glitch sometimes. Assume things you didn't foresee will happen.
Build in buffers, time, resources.
Exactly. Building in that buffer isn't being pessimistic, it's just realistic planning. It's acknowledging Murphy's Law and planning for it.
So wrapping this up, it's really clear Murphy's Law isn't just some quirky saying or an excuse for bad luck.
No, not at all. It's really a description of reality. It reflects human limits, system complexity. It doesn't guarantee failure, but it's a powerful reminder that failure is always possible.
And the smartest thing to do, based on everything we've discussed from the sources, isn't to fear it, but to plan for it.
Yes. Designing with that possibility of failure in mind. That's not negative thinking. That's actually professional discipline. It's critical thinking applied to making things work reliably.
There's a great quote in the material. Murphy's Law doesn't mean something will go wrong, only that it can. Your job is to make sure it doesn't.
Exactly. It shifts the whole thing from passive worry to active responsibility. It's empowering, in a way.
So hopefully you listening now have a much deeper appreciation for Murphy's Law, its real origins, why it feels so true, and why it's so critical in designing, well, just about anything.
And maybe you can see that really embracing that possibility of failure, really thinking through all the potential weak spots.
That's not just about preventing disasters, is it?
What if that rigorous approach, that careful consideration of what could go wrong, is actually the secret sauce, the key ingredient for building truly resilient, innovative, and successful systems, whether it's your next big project or just making sure the toast lands right side up tomorrow? Something to think about.